All right, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us today. As we're kicking off the new Bumblebee Conservation Benefit Agreement. So we're buzzing towards conservation with this new one. Great to have you all here to learn about it. We're also going to talk a little bit initially about sort of what the agreement's about, and then a little about the application process and enrolling in the agreement itself. So again, thank you all for being here today. Joined by our other panelists here. So Megan Petritis, our Conservation Program Manager, who many of you know through administering the CCAA and now the CBA. Caroline Hernandez, the Assistant Director of the Sustainable Landscapes Program, who helps facilitate the Rights of Habitat Working Group, as many of you know and have engaged with through the CCA as well. And then Allison Little, our conservation program coordinator. Allison's helping out with tech and also, helps a lot with individual partners working on enrollment. So familiar faces probably for all of you if you've been working with us in the past. Next slide. So just a couple housekeepings before we get going. First, we're muting everybody upon entry. You do have the function of using the chat to communicate with us. And there's also the Q&A option if you have questions for us as panelists at the end. We are hoping to leave a good amount of time here at the end for your questions. Feel free to use the Q&A for that, and we'll keep the chat for coordination during the meeting here. If you are having any technical issues, feel free to direct message Allison in that chat, and she'll help troubleshoot anything you need there in the webinar. Again, make sure you submit your questions for the panelists via the Q&A. That way we can also respond to those separately via chat if we don't have time to get to everything. And then as a reminder, we are recording this presentation. We will be sharing that link afterwards. We'll also have it available on the resource library with all the other recordings of other webinars that we've provided in the past. So as we get going, I want to share a little bit about the purpose of the agreement and the background. Where does it come from? What are we trying to do with this? So if you go to the next slide, I think, kind of starting large here, we're at the face of multiple crises right now. First, infrastructure, as we've heard for a long time, is, needing to be upgraded, maintained. This has been a big focus for a number of years. Road systems, bridges, energy systems are aging, in need of maintenance and needing an upgrade. That's going to require a lot of investment. At the same time, we're facing this increased demand, and with that increased demand, increasing costs with electricity and all energy. And so, as we're facing this increased demand that's ahead of us, that's also creating a demand for a build out and an expansion of the energy infrastructure in the country. But at the same time, as we have those, we're also faced with the biodiversity crisis, right? This loss of species and ecosystems across North America, really across the globe. But like it's shown here from the Living Planet report, estimates when you take all the different species and ecosystems, about 40%, almost a 40% loss since 1970. And this has been borne out in several different studies. And of course, some species are even in more decline than that. And so as we face all of those, of course, if you go to the next slide, to bring that down, right? Bumblebees are part of that decline. They're a group of species that have been, greatly affected by, land cover change, habitat loss, climate change, land use effects. So as we have in that graphic there, those different sort of causes and threats to their declines has been multifaceted. I would say largely, there's the landscapes are changing. There's an estimate from a study that came out a few years back for the early part of the 21st century, where it estimated about 24 million acres of natural land cover were lost, really over a 15, 16-year period. Just for reference, that's slightly larger than the state of Indiana across the U.S., right? So being converted for other land uses, but every time that natural land cover goes away, that's less habitat for species, which less habitat, less species, right? That's putting things on the road to a potential listing in the future. And again, there's been individual studies for different bumblebees that has played out and shown those declines, over a number of years that we cite there, and are also noted in the CBA itself. So in addition to the biodiversity, we think about all these crises together. The energy and transportation sector need solutions in the face of this change, right? That biodiversity and species loss results in, basically increased potential for listings and, with that, regulatory needs. So that increased time and coordination that's needed, that adds cost and complexity to everything. At the same time, we're trying to make things more affordable. We have an elevated operational compliance risk, right? There's more things to consider from a regulatory standpoint, which makes things more complex and costly. That also brings less flexibility for activities, right? There's less time frames to do things, more restrictions on those activities. That potential for future change, whether it's new listings or if something's already listed, regulatory changes or uplistings, increased restrictions, right? As things change, so do those requirements. And all these together we've seen can lead to an apprehension towards the industry engaging in conservation. And so we're really trying to address all of those concerns along with the species loss concerns through this agreement. You go to the next slide. This is where the Bumblebee CBA provides a pathway. It's just like the Monarch CCA, which we'll talk about here shortly. Is intended to encourage voluntary conservation, to provide that operational flexibility and that regulatory certainty that's needed to reduce those costs and uncertainties. That's done through an Endangered Species Act permit, a Section 10A1A permit for the enhancement of survival of these species. And that enhancement of survival permit comes because this is believed that we will have a real conservation benefit for targeted species and their habitats through adopting those commitments and practices in the agreement. It's also, I think, what's important to this too, which often is overlooked, is that we've seen that these agreements can also help foster local partnerships. So while we're talking about a nationwide agreement, this takes place in local places with operators, with companies, also oftentimes in partnerships. And so that give and take of giving conservation and the take of having that regulatory coverage is really a strong motivator and something that's been formalized through this agreement and through the partnership it supports. So I mentioned the Monarch CCAA. For those who aren't familiar with that, the Monarch Candidate Conservation Agreement with Assurances is also a Section 10 permit and conservation program that we facilitate here at the University of Illinois Chicago. That was approved back in 2020. Since then, we now have over 100 partners enrolled in that agreement. You can see the split between energy companies and transportation agencies. And as you can see from the map here, that's really fostered across, coast to coast, across the country, participation in conservation for monarch butterfly. So we have participation across 47 of the 48 states that covers, with 8.8 million acres now enrolled in that agreement. And because that takes an adopted acres approach to a portion of those acres enrolled, that's resulting now in 1.3 million acres of habitat conserved across the country. So great contribution from all the industry partners participating in that. If you go to the next slide, it's also resulted in really great conservation for monarch butterflies. Back in the listing proposal from 2025, the species status assessment outlined some of the other conservation practices and programs in place supporting the monarch butterfly. And so when you think about things like the Conservation Reserve Program or the compilation of different state agencies, the Monarch CCA and all the voluntary conservation provided by industry is actually third in line of programs that provide the most conservation for monarch butterfly. So it's really, really impressive. It exceeds more than what all the other records in the monarch conservation database were for conservation for that species. And so we're hoping to leverage that success and that engagement for bumblebees under this new CBA. So what is the Bumblebee CBA? Megan will give you all the details here, but big picture, right? We're trying to address, again, multiple objectives through this. The conservation needs of listed and at-risk bumblebees. We're trying to then align those actions with the operations and abilities of industry themselves. What are the tools and resources that they have within the kind of other priorities that they have to manage? We also want to reduce the administrative work to keep that focus on conservation. So we're trying to come up with sort of administratively simplified, kind of streamlined techniques that allow the university, all the industry partners that are participating, as well as Fish and Wildlife Service, less paperwork and more time focused on conservation. And in doing that, we're also trying to address all the various, legal and regulatory requirements we need to with these agreements for the Endangered Species Act, for, different aspects of Fish and Wildlife Service policy, as well as industry and regulatory risks that are faced through that. So to do that, we've engaged a lot of people in the process of developing the agreement, Fish and Wildlife Service, of course, and a lot of the species biologists working on bumblebees, industry representatives that are interested in conservation and engaging in programs like this. Of course, researchers working in conservation and bumblebee biology, as well as conservation organizations who've already been doing a lot of work in this space for a long time. So taking all of that input, think about those objectives, we then develop the actual agreement itself. So when you see the document, you're looking through that, all of these things are filtering into what is in there, what shape those conservation measures, the objectives, the requirements are all within that. And the outcome of that is really geared toward doing more conservation in more places. So as we're gearing off, we're kind of gearing up for enrollment, and that's the end goal, though, is to get more conservation in more places through those commitments. Go to the next slide. So the development of this agreement started way back in 2022 on the heels of the Monarch CCA approval. We started thinking about, obviously, there's other species that benefit from similar practices. Bumblebees were the foremost. And so we started developing the idea. We created the initial agreement actually back in 2023. And then through all those kinds of engagements and conversations, we refined that through 2024 to when we submitted the agreement in May of 2024. That then went through a different series of reviews at Fish and Wildlife Service, which then led to the approval of the agreement, roughly 2 years later in May of this year. So we're excited to get that across the finish line, to be here now to share what it's about, how to enroll in it, and how to do good work through that. So we're now moving into this enrollment and implementation phase, and this is why we love having all of you here. And so with that, I think I'm going to turn it over to Megan now to tell you a little bit more about it.
Thanks, Dan. I want to give you all an overview of the Bumblebee agreement. So Dan was covering the initial reason why we put the agreement together. So the agreement conservation goals is really what drove a lot of what we put together in the agreement, with the main goal being to sustain and improve bumblebee foraging, nesting, and overwintering habitat. And so within the agreement itself, that is addressed through these different objectives. And Dan will go over the specific conservation measures that are tied to each of these objectives. But in order to achieve this overall goal of the agreement, we broke it down into these subsequent objectives here, which we then created conservation measures for. Within the agreement itself, it includes 11 different species of bumblebees in different statuses for listing. So we have a few that are already listed, which include the rusty patch bumblebee and the Franklin's bumblebee. We have a proposed species as well. That's the Suckley's cuckoo bumblebee. Several others that are petitioned, as well as others that aren't petitioned yet, but do have some pretty severe declines. And so we really wanted this agreement to be something that not only addressed the bumblebee species that are affecting the industry now, but also have something in place to handle these future listings, or even maybe um, affect the declines in a way that they wouldn't be listed. And we've also set up the agreement in order to allow future species and other pollinators, if it makes sense, to be added under this agreement. And of those 11 different species, they all have different geographic ranges, which you can see there in the different maps for the different species that we've included in this. And the combined range for all of those different species does result in a nationwide combined species range. So this agreement is something that will, similar to the Monarch CCA, be open for enrollment for the lower 48 contiguous states in the US, which does mirror the geographic scale of the Monarch CCA. So Geographically, it's very similar. And then also eligibility wise, it is open for enrollment for both non-federal and federal entities that manage lands associated with energy and transportation uses. So that could be roadways, county roads, different substations, generation sites, etc. And also important that the enrolled lands is something that the organizations has some management control over as well. So how does an organization know which bees to target or, if an agreement like this is of interest to them, do these different occurrences affect your operations? So we do have a range map on our website that you can toggle between the different species and zoom in and out to see which species you might want to be keeping an eye on and which ones you might want to consider getting coverage for in this agreement. So if you check out our website and also Allison dropped in a link, you can see that map there to explore further. What regulatory coverage and assurances are provided? So similar to the monarch agreement, what sorts of activities are covered under this permit includes operations. So that's typical road, pipeline, utility line use, as well as access for inspections and any kind of emergency response. Also maintenance, so that includes vegetation maintenance, any sort of maintenance and repair that need to be done on those lands or on that infrastructure, facility maintenance if there is a facility structure there as well. And then also modernization activities, so that includes upgrading or rebuilding currently existing infrastructure. So if you're taking a road and expanding it, or taking a pipeline and expanding it, or upgrading it, those would all be activities covered under this agreement. It does exclude new construction, so that would be something brand new road, brand new utility line that would need to go through the typical permitting process. So as you evaluate if the Bumblebee agreement is something that your organization should enroll in, I think it's also important for us to highlight the other coverage tools that are available and what sorts of certainty are associated with those to kind of weigh in on what makes sense for your organization. So, depending on what level of certainty you're looking for, um, and what level of commitment you're looking for, that can help you make that decision. But with the CBA and some other similar Section 10 agreements, you do have the highest amount of certainty with that. So you have that regulatory certainty, you have those assurances with something like the CBA. Um, and so that was just a brief overview on what the agreement is. And so I'll pass over to Dan to discuss more about what exactly partners are committing to through the CBA.
Great, thanks, Megan. Yeah, so to get a little bit more about what you're actually committing to when you're enrolling in this agreement, if you go to the next slide. It's a series of different actions. Of course, there's the and these are all annual actions, I should say, right? There's the implementing conservation measures themselves on the lands that are enrolled, and those comprise a lot of different measures, as Megan is describing, and we'll talk further. Then tracking where those are done. So we actually have a record of what conservation was done where and to what extent. Then we also have some monitoring required in that, very simplified, but intended to simply confirm that there is habitat indeed in those areas, that are being managed for conservation purposes. That implementation, tracking, and monitoring then gets reported to UIC as that program administrator on an annual basis. And then we take all of those partner contributions, compile those, review those, and then share that with Fish and Wildlife Service in an annual report on the program. That also, well, in addition to the reporting aspects, you are complying, you're verifying you're complying with all federal, tribal, state laws, of course, as kind of standard with any of these programs. And then, because of the technical support, the program administration, there's an annual administrative fee that gets paid to UIC to help, financially support the program and keep that in place. To the next slide. So what are those requirements? What are those actual on the ground requirements? Megan, spoke to those objectives. So there is mandatory objectives or that mandatory objective about maintaining, enhancing, and protecting nesting and wintering habitat. And so there's two measures associated with that for maintaining, suitable habitat set-asides, basically keeping areas undisturbed, untouched over the course of a year. And then if you happen to come across a nest for one of these covered species, that those are protected, that there's some protection buffers around those while those are active. Those are very, very rare occurrences, and so they are actually really special when you actually find those. And so when that occurs, we want to make sure we're giving those protection in those times and places where that's needed, and while those are active. So that's mandatory. Everybody's required to do that sort of those measures under that mandatory objective. And then you have the option when you're enrolling to select three of those other objectives and then choose at least one measure per objective. There are incentives as far as reduced administrative fee costs if you choose more than one measure per objective. So we're trying to encourage more engagement in conservation through some fee reductions, which we can talk about later. But again, there's managing, protecting, enhancing foraging habitat, minimizing exposures and stressors that happen through operations, helping increase knowledge about these populations and their conservation. There's not a lot known about many of these species. We often infer what we know from one bumblebee to others. And so investing in research, helping collect data that will inform conservation is important measures in this. And then beyond that, encouraging advanced conservation commitments, right? The more that conservation practices like these and participation in programs like these becomes part of how you just operate, we want to encourage those through this because that will ultimately be good for bumblebees and a number of other species as well. And so there's a number of measures there. I will say, those measures we have here on the slide are just a few of what are possible under some of those objectives. So I do encourage you to read the Bumblebee CBA, look at those, for what other options are there. To the next slide. So in practice, just how does work on the ground if you're a roadside, if you're a solar, say, if you're transmission right away or a pipeline, whatever, fit that into the box here. But there's always a space, for the hardscape, for the infrastructure. There's often areas in that yellow that are active operations and maintenance. Maybe those have more active, management occurring. And there's oftentimes just extra buffering space where there's more periodic operations and maintenance. And so in this agreement, we're asking for conservation in all of those different spaces, right? And what those practices are look differently in each of those. Things like the nest avoidance could happen across any of those lands, and so that kind of covers the full extent. There's certainly other sort of like programmatic practices that you can adopt that would cover the full extent of your enrollment. Other measures, if you think about things like targeted herbicide use or using timed mowing, those happen to happen more in those active kind of operations maintenance space. And so there, that's going to be a subset of those lands, and those might move around year to year depending on what your schedules are. And then in those more periodic operations maintenance spaces, that's where we often see these set-aside commitments occur. Also, other measures where you're making sure those areas are undisturbed, that they're not being mowed or driven over or disturbed otherwise for maintenance purposes, so that they're just there as habitat, whether it's for foraging or for nesting or overwintering. And so that scales, that changes year to year as you work through that. Monitoring requirements are very similar to the Monarch CCAA, if you're familiar with that. So we have these 1,500 square foot plots. We made the protocol and requirements very similar to that agreement, knowing that there's many already engaged in that, like I shared earlier. We want to make these sort of fit more hand in glove so that we're not asking for different things for those different agreements where we don't necessarily need to. So we're asking for similar timing, similar levels of effort in terms of the sampling to occur. Here we're asking there's a tier 2 or tier 3 pollinator habitat scorecards that are published through the Rights Ways Habitat Working Group. We know many industry partners are already using those scorecards through things like the Monarch CCA or for their own purposes. And so it keeps that consistent with a tool that's sort of commonly used as is. And then that monitoring also informs what's the baseline condition that's, kind of specific to you and your company in the agreement. And so, over time, over 5 years, you're going to have this average score of the habitat condition based on your monitoring. And then that can be used to demonstrate, hey, you've maintained that condition. Hopefully, we've seen increases in that condition over time through participation. That graphics on the right, one shows what that 1,500 square foot plot looks like. You can visualize, 150-foot long transect by 10 feet wide. That spatially might change in its kind of orientation depending on where you're at. And then on the bottom, we have this graphic showing sort of from the Monarch CCAA, again, similar protocol, similar level effort, how we've seen that monitoring expand over that 4-year period that's shown there in participation through that effort. So then for the next slide, where we take all that, like I mentioned, like similar level of effort, there's minimum requirements for noting sort of when and where you're sampling. But then we want to know things like, what's your flowering plant cover, the number of different species, and then, we have certain elements within those scorecards that identifying the presence of different nesting overwintering resources. And so again, it's just verifying that you have habitat in those areas that you're making commitment. Beyond that, we always try to encourage to go above and beyond that minimum requirement, recording things like native and invasive species percent cover, bumblebee observations or other pollinators observed, and then potentially like other floral indicator species. These are things if you're doing that tier 3 scorecard are encompassed within that. And so if you're doing tier 3, you're already kind of catching those optional fields already. One important note, if you're in the Monarch CCA already, that sampling frequency, and as long as your enrollments completely overlap, you can basically defer to the sample frequency that you're already committing to through that program. So again, trying to make those align as much as we can together. Next slide. I mentioned tracking and reporting. So, this is then, tracking the acres at which you've completed those different conservation measures. We have a simplified sort of tracking sheet that you report that through. I know every company and organization has their own processes, tools for tracking sort of what work occurs where. So you still use your own platforms, but you report it through us through this kind of consolidated reporting sheet. We might ask for supporting documentation if we have questions on that. But then that's all provided with us. We compile that again in that annual reporting. So we can share, information like this, like we have in that graphic, which is something that we provide to our annual reporting on the Monarch CCA in terms of where and how much these different practices are occurring. So if you go to the next slide, to go from there, I mentioned that we try to work hard to make a lot of alignment between the Monarch CCA and the Bumblebee CBA. So now Megan's going to talk a little bit more about that. If you are enrolled in that and you're wondering like, well, what do I do now? So
Yeah,
Megan?
and I'm here to answer that. I'm sure a lot of you on the call are enrolled in the Monarch CCA or maybe even considering it. And so, yeah, I want to dive into, what that means for the Bumblebee agreement and how you can utilize your efforts into enrolling in that to also tack on the Bumblebee agreement as well. So for the CCA and the Bumblebee CBA, a lot of it overlaps. So the application content has very similar content of that in the Monarch CCA application. Um, a few other considerations for bumblebees. There is this baseline aspect, which I'll cover in a bit as well. That would be the biggest difference between the applications, but a lot of what you've put together already can be used, or if you're doing the two applications in tandem, there could be a lot of efficiencies there. Conservation measures. So in the Bumblebee agreement, it includes all the same conservation measures as the Monarch CCA plus some bumblebee specific conservation measures such as the nest avoidance, bumblebee research, also some new ones that we've added like the invasive species best management practices. So you can take what you were planning to do in the monarch agreement and ensure that you're meeting those requirements for the bumblebee agreement and do similar measures for both. tracking, as Dan was mentioning, the compliance tracking, the monitoring tracking, those both align. So you'll be recording some additional um, monitoring information for bumblebees, but those should both align and can be done in tandem. And then reporting, there will be one annual report that you send at the end of the year. So a typical enrollment for the Monarch CCA might look like it does there on the left, where you have some habitat set-asides already, and then some more of those active conservation measures, such as targeted herbicide or timed mowing. And so you can take that implementation plan and that work that you're already doing in the Monarch agreement, and get credit for that in the Bumblebee agreement, just making sure that you are avoiding nests on the entirety of your land, and you're also hitting those minimums of 5% for your habitat set aside and that 3% for those active conservation measures. And then also determining if some of those other measures in the Bumblebee CBA make sense for your organization, like supporting the bumblebee research, or avoiding commercial bee conflicts. So expanding, if that makes sense for you, is another option if you're transitioning into implementing the Bumblebee agreement. So how to enroll in the CBA as a CCA partner. So as I mentioned, if you're already a Monarch CCA partner, the application includes a spot to include your CI number, um, and you can determine if you want your enrolled acres to match that what you'll include in the Bumblebee CBA, and you can really just copy and paste a lot of that content in your from the Monarch CCA application into the Bumblebee application. Maybe update it here or there if it's been a while since you've applied. But you can borrow a lot of that same information because we're asking similar questions like what did the enrolled lands look like? What is the habitat condition for pollinators? And yes, add any Bumblebee CBA specific details where necessary to make sure that's a complete application. And then if you've been keeping up with your Section 7 material, you can attach the same forms to your Bumblebee CBA application. If you're not already a Monarch CCA partner, and you just want to enroll in the Bumblebee CBA, just complete that application in full as you normally would. Or if you want to apply to both at the same time, that's another option. And as I mentioned, you can borrow a lot of that same content from both of the applications. We do have a toolkit that has those guidance documents on there and example applications to help guide you through filling out these different applications. Talking now in more detail on how to enroll in the CBA itself. So there's a few steps to consider as you make your way through being a fully enrolled partner in the CBA. So first starting with verifying your eligibility. So making sure that the lands that you're enrolling or would like to enroll are energy or transportation lands. If you have that management ability over those lands, because you will need to be doing conservation work on those lands, and ability to comply with the requirements of the CBA, so the annual reporting, the administration fee, all tribal state laws, etc. And so once you verified your eligibility, then it would be good to start exploring what that enrollment looks like. So maybe you need to get some higher up buy-in. Really make sure that you review those commitments and ensure that's something that your organization can take on. What species you want coverage for, who's going to be your team that's putting this together, and who's going to be signing the CI and the application itself. So really start to dig into the details of the agreement. And then you'll start to work on preparing an application. So if you are already enrolled in the Monarch Agreement, you can borrow a lot of information from that. But you'll be putting together your narrative, a map of where you want those enrolled lands to be, what your baseline is going to be for those bumblebee occurrence areas, attaching your Section 7 species list as well, um, and ensuring that you've acknowledged all the commitments and you're ready to apply to the program. And then after you've put together your application, you'll send it over to us at USC as the program administrators to review that application, um, where we will review it, including the Section 7 material, and we'll follow up as needed with different questions and prepare your certificate of inclusion, which then you will sign and we will sign, and then you'll be fully enrolled and getting ready for implementation. So, making sure that you're ready to hit the ground running that first year, and starting to do conservation work, or continuing to do it if you're already in the monarch agreement, and starting your enrollment off strong. We have all the different application materials as well as more information on the Bumblebee CBA on our website. And on the Conservation Agreements Toolkit, you should be able to find everything you need to start prepping your application, including the application itself, an example application, the admin fee calculator. We also have the baseline tool. So I would definitely check that out if you're ready to start prepping your application. The application itself will include information like the description of the enrolled lands and that existing pollinator habitat, what covered activities you want covered under this. So just a reminder that's including operations, maintenance and modernization activities. So if you want all of those covered, including that in the application, which conservation measures you are planning on implementing, making sure that you're hitting um, the 3 out of the 4 objectives plus those mandatory conservation measures as well, how you're planning to do monitoring, confirming how many plots you need to do, timing of year, that sort of information. And then different attachments, including the Section 7 documentation, the map, or GIS data of where you want those enrolled lands to be, and determining the baseline. So if there's some documentations along with that, and if there's other helpful attachments, you can include those as well. To dig into baseline a little bit more, since that is the biggest difference between the Monarch application and the Bumblebee application. So for determining your baseline, that's the amount of acres where you have those bumblebee occurrences on your land. So that you can determine where that suitable habitat land cover is. And that is something that if you ever decide to unenroll in the agreement, you can work your way back down to that baseline that was established when you were enrolled. So in order to do this, so we do have probably the easiest option is we do have a Bumblebee baseline tool, which Allison dropped the link of that into the toolkit, and we also have instructions for that as well as a video tutorial. So that is a tool that we house on our geospatial habitat database. And once you've uploaded your center lines or other spatial data, it spits out a report that you can then take those different acreages and include it in your application and attach that report as well. If you have your own system and you want to determine the Bumblebee baseline data yourself, that is also an option. Just make sure that you attach the documentation uh, for us at the end of your application if you are doing that baseline determination yourself. And then if you're having trouble with our Bumblebee baseline tool and you don't have your own system or way of analyzing that on your own, you can also just reach out to us directly. We don't want that to be a hindrance for your application. Uh, So, also with applying to the Bumble CBA, we also want to highlight some of the discounts that are available. So we have our double down for pollinators discount. So if you are enrolled in both, so that's another good reason to have dual enrollment. There is a 30% off your combined administration fee for as long as you're enrolled in both of them. We also have an early enrollment discount. So we need those applications in by the end of August 31st. So end of day. So we have those by September 1st for that early enrollment discount of 20% off your first year, off the CBA portion of your administration fee. We also have above and beyond commitments. So this is after you're already enrolled in the CBA. If you do go above and beyond in terms of your conservation measures, with at least three additional conservation measures, there's different percentage discounts off there. I think it's 5%. And then for collecting optional monitoring fields, so those fields in the tier 3 scorecard that go above and beyond, or if you do additional plot uh, sampling outside of what's required, that's another way to get a discount. And I touched on this a little bit before, but just to visually see what the enrollment process looks like once you've given us your application, we review that application and your Section 7 documentation. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has 30 days to review what UIC has provided as our initial review. We might reach out to the applicant to clarify things or answer some questions on what they've submitted. And then so once all that is resolved, we issue the certificate of inclusion to the partner where they sign it. Then we at UIC signs it. We've confirmed that you've paid your administration fee, and then you are a newly enrolled partner. Um, so we touched on a lot of the benefits to enrolling early in the CBA. So there is those cost savings. So that early enrollment discount, you are demonstrating leadership by being one of the first organizations to enroll, and that certainly carries a lot of weight and respect. You start getting those regulatory benefits. We have several species that are already listed, so getting those regulatory benefits now. Um, is another benefit of enrolling early. And then also fame and recognition awards, I'm sure we'll give out. And yeah, who knows what being a pioneer can achieve. So resources to get you started. So these are all on our toolkits. We have the application form, the example application you can refer to as well. And then there's also the baseline acres tool. So that's the bare minimum of what you would need to get started. So if you're looking for the short list, uh, that would be the three documents that you want to start on today if you're ready for prepping your enrollment. And so with that, I've seen several questions come in through Q&A, so we're now going to open it up to questions, and Caroline's going to be leading that.
Thank you, Megan. Thank you, Dan. Yeah, I've got lots of questions coming through. Keep asking them. And if we don't get to them by the end of this webinar, we can follow up with you all individually with answers to those questions. So to get us started, Dan, I'm going to have you answer this one. What does avoidance of known observed nest sites look like as a conservation measure and practically on the system, both as like a minimum requirement for like tracking, training, reporting, and compliance for like going above and beyond?
Yeah, I mean, as far as, you know, the intent isn't that you're out, necessarily actively looking for nests, but, as you're doing your work in the field, right, if a bumblebee nest or, suspected nest is identified, we ask that somebody takes a picture of that, sends it to us so that we can then work with either our conservation partners or the service to, you know, identify, yes, is it a bumblebees? And then, if it's something that's, potentially one of these covered species. Um, I think, again, this is a very rare occurrence. So if we have that it's likely to be something, I think we want to do some additional coordination on that. There are some avoidance distances. If you look at table 6-2 in the CBA, for all of these conservation measures, there's the minimum expectations. So maybe the simple answer is read the minimum expectations in the table for what that measure entails. But there are some different distances that, depending on what the activity is, range from 10 to 300 feet to do avoidance around that nest, right? So don't do certain things within these different distances if those are found. Uh, for example, so I live in the state of Wisconsin. They've been doing a lot of, surveys for things like rusty patch. Um, and even after all of that, maybe like half a dozen nests, maybe a few more have been found because there's been more concerted efforts to find that over the past few years. But even with intentionally trying to look for these, it's really difficult to find them. So again, it is really rare and really exciting if you do find one of these. But we're not asking people necessarily to go out and do active searching for those nests. It's simply if you're coming across those while you're doing other activities, we want to make sure those are protected.
Thank you, Dan. Uh, Megan, thinking about annual reporting, if you are enrolled in the Monarch CCAA and then are enrolled in the Bumblebee CBA, is that a combined annual report? What does the overlap look like? And then if you submit your CBA application before August 31st, would you be submitting that combined report, the CBA as well at the January 2027?
Yeah, so if you're enrolled in both agreements, it will be a combined annual report that you'll be submitting. So we'll be asking similar questions for both of the agreements, and there'll be a lot of overlap with that report that you have to submit, including the monitoring information if you do have the same enrolled lands. For both the Monarch agreement and the Bumblebee agreement, you can double up your monitoring there. And then there's a combined compliance tracking spreadsheet. So it's all yeah, one package that so if you are enrolled in both, you'll be sending that one annual report to us that covers both agreements. If you apply before August 31st, I think there is a chance that you'll have to submit an annual report for the Bumblebee agreement given our turnaround time for application reviews. But it's maybe less likely that you'll have to do Bumblebee specific monitoring because if it's after the growing season, so after August 1st, um, then monitoring is not required.
Thank you. Dan, another one for you. Can you speak to any potential for state level protections or any state agency coordination to date for bumblebee species and for the CBA?
Yeah, and I just got to note my connection's unstable. So if I need to, if I don't come through, let me know. Um, yeah, so we have been starting to do some state outreach with different agencies and CDFW. We have not talked specifically about Crotch's Bumblebee. I know they're aware of the agreement, but we haven't had specific on discussions on sort of, reciprocity or, is it compatible for state level coverage? Uh, some states, each state endangered species law protection is different, so that's going to be different state to state. Um, I know some states are looking at this and considering how can they sort of, adopt the regulatory coverage at a state level? Do they have mechanisms to do that? But yeah, certainly welcome more conversations with CDFW if there's interest there.
Thank you. Megan, could you provide some examples of practical regulatory benefits for enrolling in the CBA, especially for like a road maintenance organization? And then also, can you speak to any kind of construction projects on the highway and right of way?
Yeah, so the coverages cover things like typical road use, so you wouldn't need to get permits for these different bumblebee species for typical road use, road access, utility line access. Also, the vegetation management practices a lot of organizations do on their rights of ways. That's all covered. So as long as you're doing the conservation mowing on certain areas of your land, there's different maintenance practices that are also allowed under these coverages. And then probably most notable is the expansion or upgrading of different facilities. So if you're expanding a roadway or utility line, those are all things that are covered under this agreement.
If I can just add to that briefly. So I saw that question there to kind of build on what Megan's saying. Like if you have it's like a widening project, um, right? You're going to acquire right away. You're going to also be, obviously impacting habitat. The CBA is intended to cover situations like that. So if you have, let's say, one of these Bs covered or comes up in like an IPAC review, if you're enrolled, I mean, you have that permit coverage. So you simply note that, in your consultation documents, that you're already covered under this permit for that, the take associated with those activities, provided that it's a covered species and it's a covered activity and you're in compliance with the agreement. But it should be pretty simple then when you get into the project specific impacts.
Thank you both. Dan, I've got a couple of questions about monitoring throughout. So can you talk to me about bee monitoring? What type of data are you trying to, are we looking for? Overlap in terms of like monitoring plots for for an enrolled partner that's enrolled in both the CCAA and CBA, and then the can you do that same monitoring in the same plots, especially if the plant phenology matches up with your eco region?
Yeah. Again, we've spoken to that. There's a lot of work to kind of overlap the Monarch CCA protocol with the CBA protocol. So if your enrollment overlaps, then yes, you can basically use what you're using for the CCA, as far as like the number of plots, the location of those plots, and do the CBA monitoring, which would cover the CCA. It would do it all at the same time, essentially. So that's very, sort of rapid assessment, habitat focused, just asking to kind of verify we have habitat there. It's simple on purpose. Um, as far as bee monitoring specifically, we're not actually asking you to collect bumblebee data itself. Simply noting if you're seeing bumblebees using the habitat is sort of what we ask for, sort of as an optional data collection for the standard monitoring. I will say though, then there's one of the conservation measures under that, sort of addressing knowledge and conservation needs is to collect and submit data through, say, like the Bumblebee Atlas projects, right? So Xerces and other entities have, well, Xerces has the Bumblebee Atlas, and some states have their own kind of Atlas, projects where you can record observations, submit those, so it's then publicly available data on species in these areas. And that can help inform the wider kind of conservation need, find new occurrences. So if you do that as a conservation measure, that's simply, taking photo, taking an ID, submitting it through those projects. So that's really all we're asking for. We're not asking for detailed surveys. We don't have to be a bee biologist to necessarily participate in this. It's intended to be simple.
Thank you both. And I think we've got a few more slides to end on. So I would encourage you all, if you still have questions, we're going to have our contact information at the end of this presentation that you can send us questions or add them in here. Although if you are adding your question as an anonymous attendee, then it is hard for us to get back to you on that. So I would encourage you to email us directly with some of those questions. We will also be sending out the link to this recording in an email to everyone that's registered at the end, and we'll have it posted to our resources library as well. So you can always come back to this webinar. So thank you again for that. On the next slide, Megan, if you're interested in how to get involved, we do have options for you depending on the type of organization you are representing. So if you are an energy company or a DOT, of course, you can actually apply on the next. If you click one more. So you can check out enrollment, you can apply to the agreement, do all of that through the toolkit that Megan talked about. And we've got those application resources, we've got frequently asked questions and things like that. And then, of course, we encourage you to reach out to us. And sometimes it's just easier to ask those questions one-on-one with us. If you are not an organization that can enroll in our agreement, we would just encourage you to encourage other organizations to enroll in this agreement. This is all about voluntary conservation and getting as much habitat on the ground as possible, while also making it easier for our energy and transportation partners to continue their vegetation management while still doing good work. There's also opportunities for collaboration with those organizations that are enrolling. There's a research component as one of those conservation measures, and we're always looking for more information, for better guidance, for especially that regional and local support. We're trying to cover the entirety of the United States with these agreements. And so if you are an agency that has some of that information or that guidance, we'd love to be able to share that with any of our applicants. The same goes for training and identification resources. We also, this has just been finalized. We're trying to spread the word and trying to get more organizations to know about this agreement and involved, and would appreciate your help spreading that word. And if you have any constructive feedback or any feedback at all, we'd love to hear it. We'd love to hear, how we can continue improving and expanding. And if you like it, that also makes our day too. We're a really small team and we work really hard, and we immediately share those accolades to each other as well, and it means a lot as well. On the next slide, so we are hosting a working group meeting. So, we're representing the Rights of Ways Habitat Working Group, and we host a working group meeting at least once a year. We are hosting one in Utica, New York, with the New York Power Authority, and this is going to be a really great meeting and an opportunity to learn from each other. We're also going to have specific sessions on the Monarch CCAA and the Bumblebee Agreement, and this will be hands-on time where you can learn from us and each other. And we'll also have field learning sessions where you can see work on the ground being done from organizations that are actively involved in this type of conservation work. Then we'll have those roundtable discussions, breakout sessions, and then, of course, as I mentioned, that conservation agreement workshop that's being led by Megan. So I think it'll be a really great meeting, and we still have time to have you all register, and also sponsorship opportunities are still available. So please reach out and register. On the next slide, we think it's really important to recognize the development of this agreement. It was a huge haul. We've got a small team, and we wouldn't be able to do it without the support of our partners, so our industry partners. This also wouldn't be a very useful agreement if it wasn't something that our industry partners thought they could sign up for. And so they've put a lot of time and effort into making this agreement happen, as well as on the next slide, we have our technical partners as well that have helped make this agreement happen. So really just want to thank everyone and really emphasize just what a massive undertaking this agreement has been for everyone, and really appreciate the input and feedback that we've gotten from everyone. So as I promised, I would encourage you all to reach out to us. Those are our email addresses. We've got a LinkedIn account where we give updates on webinars and activities and things like that. And then you can, of course, go to our Bumblebee CBA toolkit as well through those. So I hope that you all found this a useful webinar, and I really appreciate your time, Dan and Megan and Allison, for making this webinar happen. And I hope to hear from everyone soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.